Thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you all from across the country and a few from the Pacific and New Zealand, no doubt as well. My name is Jessica Robbins. I'm joining from ICLEI, Oceania. I'm in Nipaluna, Hobart, in front of the beautiful Kanani mountains surrounded by nature. And I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people, and their 40,000 years of lived connection and stewardship. I also pay my respects, of course, to elders past, present and future, and to the Palawa and Aboriginal community that continue to care for country, continue to inspire us with that connection between traditional land use and practice to how it is that we can take forward those system thinking processes. And also recognise that the sovereignty of the Palawa and Aboriginal people were never ceded. So please do feel free, as you are filtering in, to just introduce your name and the traditional land that you are also from. Of course, you can also feel free to keep your camera on, particularly at this starting point, just to encourage a little bit of social connection and so that we can see your smiling faces. Yeah, we have a fantastic turnout today. So a huge number of people joining us because we've got certainly a very hot topic in greening the private realm. So just to keep things all hospitable and fantastic, please do stay muted throughout the event. You are, however, encouraged to make comments and chat via the window function throughout the event. We will have a panel discussion at the end of the event, which will be facilitated by Belinda. If you do want to ask questions, then please do just go ahead, ask those questions as we go through the event, and Belinda will relay them later to the panellists. And of course, you would have noticed that the event is being recorded, and so we will be sharing this after the event's wrapped up. Anyway, my great honour to introduce Steve Gawler, the Regional Director of Oceania, to take us through the event. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, and hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. And look, we've got people from across the ditch. I've just seen my friend Paul Blaschke. Hi, Paul. Hello, everyone else. Lots and lots of familiar faces and names, and quite a few new people too. So welcome aboard. This is all a part of the ICLEI Cities with Nature program. Some of your councils are already working with us on that, and anyone can join Cities with Nature. It's one of those silly programs that ICLEI offers because it's free and you don't have to be an ICLEI member. And it's backed up by an international platform and partners. So it's a great program. And what we've been doing for the last year or so is starting to run webinars on some of the real high priority areas that we identified in some interviews that we did with the councils. So today we're looking at, again, the real chestnut of how can we as local governments really drive canopy cover and greening through the private property part of our councils? We all struggle with this. We've all got very ambitious tree planting programs in our own property, in council land, etc., but there's limitations to that. And so the game changer will be when all new developments and existing developments retain and increase their canopy cover. We started this last year. We held the first part of this webinar in November, where we looked mainly at what incentives, how can we encourage? We looked at more of a marketing aspect to how to promote private canopy cover. And we sort of parked for this webinar today the whole challenges of what levers do local governments have available to them in terms of regulations, planning controls, any rating incentives, etc. So that's what we're going to focus on largely today. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce Amanda Stone. Councillor Stone is from the City of Yarra. She is the chair of the ICLEI Advisory Committee here in ICLEI Oceania. Amanda also sits on the ICLEI Global Executive Committee and has a special portfolio there for nature. And we've just asked Amanda to speak to us for a few minutes now about the International Biodiversity Framework and the opportunity for local governments to become involved. So over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for joining us for this chestnut that Steve has described. It's something that we're all preoccupied with. It's challenged local government forever, particularly as our urban areas become more dense and the need for urban greening becomes more urgent. And this, of course, is a global problem. It's not unique to us. Globally, there's 55% of people are living in cities, but in our country, it's 85%. So it's a very particular problem to Australia. And we're all working very hard at the local level to protect and enhance nature in our cities. And of course, tree canopy is part of the bigger picture of biodiversity, isn't it? So there's this global dimension to what we're all doing in our own municipalities. The Global Convention on Biodiversity was signed by 150 government leaders at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and it's dedicated to promoting sustainable development. And Australia is a signatory to this convention, and we are represented at the COPs, the conferences of the parties. Now, there was a conference of the parties to this biodiversity convention began last year. It was meant to be held in Kunming, China. It's now going to be held at the end of this year in Montreal for a whole lot of COVID-related reasons. This conference of the parties is actually going to come up with a new 10-year global agreement on how we're going to protect biodiversity, tree canopy being part of that in our cities and in our regions and in our countries. One of the problems with this has been that the last 10-year agreement that was agreed to, obviously 10 years ago in Japan, has not been delivered on. And in the meantime, species are becoming extinct, biodiversity is being lost at a rapid rate. And in fact, we're now where we would call right now, we're at the Paris moment for biodiversity. It's now or never to really turn the situation around. So COP15 in Montreal is going to be a very, very important agreement. This is the only convention, the only global convention that has an explicit role for local government in it. It's spelled out. And we all know that local government is where the action happens in so many things, including nature and biodiversity. So it's really important that stays in there. ICLEI has a seat at the table through these negotiations and is pushing the role of local government. And one of the ways in which local governments can demonstrate their support for this convention and the next post-2020 plan is to sign the Edinburgh Declaration. I'll put details of it in the chat because I know you want to get on with the webinar, but this is a high-level political commitment to supporting both the convention and the next 10-year plan, and hopefully that will actually lead in turn for support for local governments to actually help implement it, because they have a really key role. And of course, greening that we're talking about today is a key role. So thank you for listening to that little spiel about the global picture. It's really important. It's hard for us to make the connection sometimes, isn't it? But sometimes if we've got this global framework, it can actually help us embed nature and embed greening in all of our operations at local government, and it can only help the work that you do. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And so we'll now go into the main part of the webinar. We've got 3 speakers, as you've seen. Our first speaker is from Western Australia, from the city of Nedlands in Perth, followed up by Mayor Michael Hewitson from the city of Unley in Adelaide, and then Judy Bush from the University of Melbourne. So we're getting quite different perspectives, from the officer perspective, the elected member perspective, and from the academic perspective. And then Belinda Bean from Greener Spaces, Better Places is then going to facilitate the discussion. We won't have time for questions after each of the 3 presentations, so please put them in the chat. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Bonnie Hall. Bonnie is Senior Strategic Planning Officer for the City of Nedlands in Western Australia. And the reason we're interested to hear from Bonnie is she did some pretty impressive research recently of how councils around Western Australia are putting in place policy settings so that they can drive greening of the private realm, and use that then to recommend to her own council how they should proceed. So Bonnie will speak a little bit longer than the other 2, because this really gives us quite a good scan of our options. So Bonnie, over to you, and I think you're sharing your own slides.
Perfect, thanks Steve. That looks like it's up for me, so perfect, thank you. So yeah, thanks very much, Steve, and hello to everyone who's joined. It looks like we're almost cracking 100, so that's really exciting. And thanks to ICLEI for hosting this webinar today and for giving me a chance to share what's happening at Nedlands. So we started investigating tree retention options around mid last year. And during this process, my team and I reached out to a number of other councils in WA, and we also joined the Western Australian Local Government Association, WALGA Urban Forest Tree Group, which gave us access to what lots of other councils are doing. So it was really good to get a chance to have those conversations with other councils to see what was working, what wasn't working, and work together to try and get a consistent approach as much as possible. So my presentation today, I'll be going through a brief overview of the investigations which we've gone through, starting from the existing green leafy character of Nedlands through to the finer detail of the proposed approach that we're taking. So the green leafy streets and backyards of Nedlands is really a key part of the city's character. The importance of retaining this character has come through really strongly in the city's strategic community plan, as well as more detailed engagement, which we've done recently for our infill areas. And compared to other councils in Perth and across Australia, Nedlands sits pretty highly for tree canopy cover, which we can see in this graph here. So Nedlands sits at about 20% canopy cover, which is just above the average for the councils which were investigated for this work. The majority of the city of Nedlands is zoned urban, which is this pink area here in the map. So that's about 60% is urban. And this area is generally privately owned. So that's the reason that we've really tried to focus on this private land tree retention. So in terms of the changes in canopy cover that we've been seeing, we have really been seeing an increase in tree canopy cover in our public areas, so in our parks and roads. We've also been seeing an increase in on private land generally. So that's that street blocks category there. And where we've been seeing decrease is in development sites. So we can see there from 2009 to 2016, the canopy on development lots fell about 50%. So the city does currently have a urban forest strategy in place, though it only deals with trees on public land. And so around mid last year, our council instructed administration to start investigating ways that we could protect and enhance canopy on private land. So this slide here is a really broad overview of the different options which we investigated. So the first options that we looked at were significant tree registers. And so these can either be voluntary or non-voluntary. So for your voluntary tree register, it will set the criteria for what is considered a significant tree. There will be a nomination process for how people will nominate a tree to go on the register. For the voluntary option, the landowner consent, so the land that the tree is on, the owner consent is required to place the tree on the register. And the decision to place the tree on the register is either a council decision or it can be delegated down to officers. If the tree is added onto the register, you generally require development approval to remove the tree from the site. The non-voluntary tree register works in a similar way, though the landowner consent is not required to put the tree on the register. And because of that, the decision to put the tree on the register is generally a council one. The third option that we looked at was a policy or a planning scheme requirement to retain trees other than a significant tree register. And so that involves a trigger for development approval to be required to remove a tree meeting certain criteria. And as part of that, you would stipulate what that criteria is for the tree to be regulated in that way. The fourth option that we looked at was prioritising the planting of new trees. Oops, sorry, let's go back. And so that involves specifying, so as part of that, you can specify the planting of trees of a certain pot size, so advanced trees, not just small saplings. And then the fifth option that we looked at was prioritising canopy cover on public land rather than private land. And so that would be in areas such as your road reserves and your parks. And it can also involve controlling the location and the size of new vehicle crossovers, so to maximise the verge space for new trees. A part of that as well can be undergrounding power, so that there's more room above ground for trees. So in terms of the pros and the cons of each approach, for the voluntary register, this is going to be less politically sensitive because people have a choice as to whether their tree is listed or not. It can also foster really positive community spirit. It can be a good news story. However, you're probably going to be capturing trees which would likely be retained anyway if the owners are nominating those trees to go on the list. And so typically we've seen that this involves very few trees being added to these lists, and together with the internal resourcing required to administer those lists, we typically saw those to be low value approaches to tree retention. The non-voluntary tree list did capture more trees than the voluntary register, but some considered it to be a burden on those landowners that had the trees listed, and it still captures relatively few trees. The third option, so that the policy or the scheme requirement for retention other than the tree register, is going to have a wider application than the significant tree register because it doesn't rely on nominations. It would apply to all trees that fit your specified criteria. This approach can be difficult to set up, and because it has a wider application, it affects more trees, it's going to have an increased workload on your statutory planning team. In terms of prioritising new tree planting, this approach really acknowledges the challenges of retaining trees in an infill setting. And you can specify the species of the trees going in so that they're suitable for the soil and the location. However, those new trees going in will take time to reach their maturity. For the fifth option, looking at public land planting rather than private land, this is going to be easier for a city to manage, given that it's its own land that it's dealing with. And it can be a good news story for the council because they can report on how many new trees they're planting within a given period of time. However, this option puts the cost burden on the council, removes the responsibility from developers and landowners, and it's potentially not as effective at addressing the urban heat island effect, given that the trees aren't going to be located as closely to dwellings. So this is the option that the City of Nedlands is pursuing, the policy and scheme approach other than the significant tree register. And this is what it looks like for us. So for the scheme amendment, this is introducing a trigger for development approval to be required to remove trees meeting certain criteria. And the intent of this approach is to allow us to consider whether tree removal is going to be appropriate. We've focused this approach on our lower density areas, so R20 or less. The reason being is that these areas have a much higher open space requirement and therefore more space to facilitate tree retention, although we are now pursuing a similar option for our medium density areas as well. In support of the scheme amendment, we're also pursuing a local planning policy. So this would guide the assessment of those development applications for tree removal. As part of this, we would request an arboriculture report, and the policy would also specify how trees are replaced if removal is supported by the city. So that the two factors that would be considered in the assessment of a development application for tree removal is firstly the health, structural stability, or the risk to life or property from the tree, and that's where the arboriculture report comes in. And secondly, whether the redesign of development around the tree is feasible or not. And that is up to the applicant to provide the evidence of that, and the city has the discretion to say whether that's appropriate or not. So in terms of the status of both of these two mechanisms, the scheme amendment has been approved by council for advertising. That occurred in June, a few months ago, and that is now with the Western Australian Planning Commission and the Environmental Protection Authority for their sign-off before we go ahead and advertise. And the local planning policy is going up to council for approval to advertise in a couple of weeks. So, as this proposed approach was being discussed through our council, there was a lot of attention in the media, and this was reflective of a very highly involved community. There was a mix of support and objections in the newspapers. Those objecting were primarily concerned with undermining private property rights, and they considered that the city should instead focus on tree plantings in the public realm rather than private property. Other concerns raised were with the maintenance of retained trees and the burden that this created for landowners, and again suggesting that we incentivise tree retention rather than trying to mandate it through these mechanisms. I also just wanted to mention a local community group with over 700 people, Nedlands Tree Canopy Advocates. They definitely made their voices heard during this process, and we really appreciate the input that they provided along the way. So we had council support when we took this process through council. So we first took it to them in December, and we got approval to commence with the investigations. More recently, we have had approval for the scheme amendment to be taken through to advertising as well. So in terms of the finer detail, the scheme amendment comes down to these two areas. So the tree criteria and the exemptions. The tree criteria looks at three areas: trunk circumference, tree height, and canopy diameter. With the trunk circumference, we were initially looking at 2 to 3 metres in line with South Australian approach. However, as part of the investigations, we looked at the Conservation Council of South Australia's report that they released on the comparison of Australia's tree laws. And that report suggested reducing the circumference criteria and also including additional criteria such as tree height and canopy diameter, which we've now done. Some preliminary advice that we've got from the Environmental Protection Authority as well is that the 1.5 metre trunk circumference is appropriate to set as the criteria, as that's the minimum size for a tree to provide nesting hollows for threatened black cockatoos, which are found throughout Nedlands. So in terms of the exemptions that we've got with our scheme amendment, we have a list of unwanted tree species, which we've collaborated on with our technical services team and an external consultant as well to make sure that that list is appropriate for Nedlands. We've also exempted pruning in accordance with Australian standards, which is pretty consistent with what other councils do in this space, and also exemptions for clearing of trees for bushfire purposes or for utility purposes such as clearance from power lines. So as part of this process, we also went out to a local park and just measured the tree circumference of various trees, just to get our heads around what that looked like in terms of the size of the trees. And this was a really, really beneficial exercise just to put it into context for us. So just to wrap it up, there's no silver bullet. Each of the options that I've outlined has its own pros and cons, and you can also attempt multiple different options. You don't have to just go for one. It's really important to have your council and your community on board. Otherwise, it was very unlikely to get off the ground in the first place. And if you do have those local advocacy groups, definitely tap into them. Very helpful to contextualise tree criteria so that you can get a sense of what that looks like for your local government area. and to definitely lean on the experience of other councils as well. You don't have to try and reinvent the wheel. So that is pretty much it from me. These were some of the really helpful sources that we used as part of our investigations. The Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage in WA also has some really great resources in terms of canopy cover change and urban forest mapping. So that is all from me. I think I'll hand back to Steve now. Let me just stop sharing.
Bonnie, thank you. That was really useful, as we said, to do such a comprehensive scan. Congratulations on the study, and it'll be very interesting to see how Nedlands proceeds through all of those steps that you've outlined. It leads very nicely to Michael Hewitson's presentation too. Michael is Mayor of the City of Unley, which is a beautiful inner city suburban council of Adelaide, probably got a lot of similarities to Nedlands. And Michael spoke at our webinar last year on work that they were doing on almost the same thing, weighing up the pros and the cons of investing more in public land as opposed to private property. We've invited Michael to come back on again, partly because he's such a great speaker, but also because I think you've got an update for us on your advocacy to the state government.
Yep.
So yeah, looking forward to hearing from it. Thanks, Michael.
Look, Bonnie, your presentation was great to hear. It lets us know in Unley how far we've actually proceeded, and good luck with the journey. I'm very proud of it. Nedlands was 20% canopy cover. Well, when I took over as mayor, we were losing 2% of our trees each year in Unley. We had 26% cover. And you know what? As mayor, 3 years later, we were up to 28%. So we've actually solved half our problems with the programs that I talked about last year. Next slide, please. Oh, I haven't got the slides. Whoops. Yeah, sorry. Look, this is all, what we're doing now is all made, go back, yes, please. All made possible by the extraordinary work of our council. You can see down to the nearest metre squared, in fact, it's nearest 1/10 of a metre squared, exactly how many trees were planted, how many trees were removed, how much was pruned, etc. In fact, in Unley, every single property has on its rate notice the tree canopy cover they have now and what they had 3 years ago. Next, I'll just give that revision. Now, where we're up to now, well, we were losing 8 hectares per annum, and now we're losing 4. Even why have we increased? Well, people are removing less trees, but the tree increase is temporary. We're having 2 trees taken out of public land, private land, I meant, for every tree that we're planting on public land. And we're going to run out of public land place to put the trees. We're planting at such a rate that within the next 5 years, we've fully planted. And at that point, we only contribute not 28%, but 6.4% on public land. So Nedlands, the private land is absolutely vital. You've got to win the private land. Okay, next. Now, what happens if we don't come up with new incentives? We've done the obvious things like the let's have a raffle, depending on how much tree cover is in your area, and you get so many tickets and you can win an $80 prize to plant a tree into the area. And we've done the giveaways, we've done the education, and by putting it on the rate notice, actually, that is actually proved, I think, absolutely significant, because it's important enough to put it in the rate notice, and everybody knows that the council, and you can just fly over Unley and see every property, what it was 3 years ago, what it is now. And the fact is that it is dead accurate, because I pruned all my fruit trees under a net at 3 metres. 3 metres are cut off, and below 3 metres, nothing gets measured. And if it pushes up above the net, by heck, it's getting it right. So a lot of confidence. We've had no complaints about the accuracy of what we're doing. So the 10 centimetres squared looking good. So what's at stake for us? We don't want to be Western Sydney. You can see just 2 streets in Unley. One was 32 degrees and the other one 42 degrees. Same day, same heat map, and difference 30% canopy versus 10. Next. Wonderful. So what are we going to do to nail the other? Because the story is our children will cook if we keep losing 4 hectares out of 400 each year. We're still not winning once we stop planting our council trees. So our proposal is for new development offsets. If you can remember the mass of the first slide that I showed you, you will see down to the nearest square metre how many trees we are losing from new developments. And we know that we are losing 2 hectares, half of it, 2 hectares a year from just 206, roughly, it's very close to that year after year, of new developments increase the built form. The other half of new developments that increase the built footprint actually increase the tree canopy. So we've actually got measuring tools, and it's won a national award, this work, and so that's helpful for people to know. You might want to get in touch with the Unley staff. Now, what we're proposing is if a new development has less than 15% tree canopy, they pay 10 or 15% higher rates until they get their 15% is achieved. The money's to go into a tree land fund. Problem. We need the signature of the State Minister for Planning to be able to run the scheme. Next. State government in South Australia controls the planning rules. The new Labor Minister asked our council for a letter of support from the opposition. We just changed government. The other government was talking, yes, we're going to sign this and do that, and they were going through the bureaucratic process, and they never quite got round to it during their term in office. So the new minister, Nick Champion, asked for shadow cabinet support. The problem, the opposition actually signed off approval. The shadow cabinet supported it. Unfortunately, the press release hopped into the minister for not having also signed it, which meant it's become a bit of a political football, which we have to wear. But we are seeking a 10-year trial, and if we have to trial, we might have something to show the world of how to solve inner city suburban tree canopy cover. Next. Now, council elections are coming up, and so the minister's probably wise to wait a bit and just find out if this mayor gets chucked out or whether this mayor gets re-elected to office. And the council itself is willing, the new council is willing to actually support what's going on, but which is unfortunate. The 2 hectares parameter is the remaining gap if new development off-sun is approved. So we've got 2 problems. One, the new developments is half, and we've still got a gap of 2. Council have voted against consulting our committee on rating standards for existing property owners to have a rebate if they contain a percentage tree canopy cover. Wrong end of the cycle. You don't do that just before an election, and it's put up as therefore actually a penalty for not having the cover rather than an incentive to actually plant and keep trees. Next. You can see the variations that we can each sub. In fact, we can go down to the street. We can do it by street. The whole program of our computing staff can do streets, houses, neighbourhoods, whatever you like. And so there you can see the variation. And you could have it, for example, in Wavewood, if you've got more than 16.9% canopy cover, you get 2% rate rebate. By heck, if you get the neighbours talking, and it'd be a great educational tool. Next. Only councils develop the capacity to develop new incentive ideas, including the power to act because of the outstanding IT work of our staff. Some ideas can be politically undermined by describing incentives as penalties for not having tree canopy cover on your own property. The offset fund for new developments has no retrospective implications, and that's the beauty of it, because our new code rules require new developments to have some soft soil and a planted tree. You don't have to keep it, you can just pull it out, the lots are. What we're offering the minister is a chance to make the new code actually work so that when they plant a tree, there's a real financial incentive to get it to grow, to save either 10% or 15% rate, which goes into a tree land offset fund. If they don't plant a tree, we get the money to buy the land, and after 200 years, and council's long-term thinking, the great-great-great-grandchildren of Unley won't cook. They'll have 31% tree canopy cover. Just do the maths yourself. That's what we're after. That's our target. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Isn't it interesting to hear, you know, the very technical work that Bonnie was doing, the way that had to be aligned with the council's support, and then hearing Michael talk again about the political layer, and not only the local government political layer, but the next one up. So we're getting a real reality check here. And again, congratulations to Unley for doing such a great job. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest from the other participants here today. So moving on to our third and final speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Judy, Dr. Judy Bush from the University of Melbourne. And Judy's been working with and in and around local government for many, many years. So she knows the workings of local government particularly well, but she is an academic and has been doing work particularly with the City of Melbourne recently on policy mechanisms for driving greening of the private realm. So Judy, very happy to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. And hello, everyone. I see lots of familiar names in the participant list. So yeah, virtually hello to friends and to new acquaintances. And thanks for the opportunity to talk today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging traditional owners. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge sovereign land never ceded. And I acknowledge the rich cultural heritage that we have been invited to share. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about policy mechanisms. So really, it's been great listening to our previous speakers, Bonnie and Michael. Hopefully I will be able to bring together their material and then talk a little bit about the Green Factor tool at City of Melbourne. So we can think of policy mechanisms falling into maybe 4 key categories, and certainly Bonnie, the work that you did, I think, you know, reinforced this idea of these 4 categories of government provision and demonstration. So we can see that in parks and street trees and so on. Information and community engagement, incentives, awards and grants, and then also regulations. And policy researchers and policy practitioners have really reinforced that a single mechanism is unlikely to be sufficient for environmental policies that aim to address complex issues in complex systems. And so that's one of the key challenges, I suppose, that we need to face. So if we're looking at policy mechanisms for private land, it's really those 3 dot points here. So I'm going to quickly just highlight examples of those. So information and community engagement, of course, you know, brochures, guidelines, local government does that so well. CitiesWithNature is participating actively in that space as well. You know, lots and lots of information provided to local residents as well as businesses, service providers and so on. Incentives, awards and grants. So, you know, here in Victoria, we have the annual Premier's Sustainability Awards, ICLEI awards, exemplary examples of landscape architecture and so on. One year, a private green roof won a Premier's Sustainability Award, a green roof on an apartment building, a residential apartment building. And certainly grants and incentives are a key policy mechanism as well. Of course, regulations are something that we've been really talking about in this session as well. And regulations cover a range of different sorts of mechanisms. So as you can see here in this bubble, planning scheme provisions are obviously a big one, particularly for local governments. So zones and overlays, clauses for a minimum area to be put aside for pervious surfaces or for land sufficient for tree growing and so on. Then also local laws and very much, you know, the significant tree registers, canopy tree registers, retention of canopy trees often sit within local laws. And then tree bonds are maybe another mechanism that some local governments are looking at for protection of trees during construction periods. Of course, the key thing with regulation is that it needs to be enforced for it to be effective, and it needs to the residents, the ratepayers, the businesses need to know that it will be enforced for it to be effective. I recently wrote a book chapter with an environmental lawyer, Laura Skiers, Stewardship, Retrofitting Private Property with the Public Interest in Ecology. I think some of the issues that we've been talking about today about, really seeing trees as caring for trees on private land as part of stewardship responsibilities. So I think at this stage that paper is free for download. So if you're interested, look at that link. I understand our slides are going to be circulated after the presentation today. So just going back to we've talked about these 4 different types of policy, and at the start I said we can't rely on a single mechanism to achieve our objectives when we're dealing with complex situations. And so we can see that if we're setting our policy mechanisms in a way that will facilitate more nature, then we can see that, for example, regulation sets the minimum standards. It calibrates, it provides the minimum standards that everyone must achieve. Incentives then should be set so that they push best practice and push innovation. And we need to make sure that policy mechanisms aren't set in the wrong way, so that, for example, regulations specify a maximum ceiling and don't allow people to do better. And we also need to make sure that, for example, incentives don't just pay for business as usual, but are actually paying to push best practice and innovation. So that's a really quick whiz through of policy mechanisms. Steve also asked me to talk about the Green Factor tool. So I will talk a little bit about the Green Factor tool. I was lucky enough to be part of the consultancy team that worked on developing this Green Factor tool for City of Melbourne. And I saw someone else from Hip versus Hype here in the participant group. So they were the lead consultants for this work. So City of Melbourne have been doing a lot of work on urban greening for, more than a decade. They identified that retention of vegetation and increase of vegetation in new development is a key challenge, and really Bonnie and Michael both highlighted that it's the development processes that are seeing the reduction of greening. So being able to foreground greening in the development process and create a planning mechanism to increase the amount of greening was seen to be important. So this Green Factor tool is designed to be applied during the planning process. It defines a minimum area of greening, and in recognition of the fact that it applies to inner city areas, it acknowledges that it's not just in-ground greening, but that it can also be green roofs, green walls, green facades. And importantly, it's underpinned by a research evidence base, which is where I came in, and also integrates City of Melbourne's strategic policy priorities. And the research evidence base was seen to be important from City of Melbourne's perspective to strengthen the credibility and authority of the tool, to make it more rigorous in the face of potential complaints from development industry or whoever for its application. So you can see here that the tool acknowledges a range of functions that greening provides, these 7 functions here. We reviewed a full list of ecosystem services and thought about what functions could feasibly be provided within a residential lot, for example. And so these are the functions. And so these were identified from research, and I then documented the research evidence base to support claims for their delivery. And then the weighting of these various different functions responded to City of Melbourne's policy priorities. So City of Melbourne said cooling is our most important priority, therefore that gets 25%. Habitat for biodiversity is our second most important, that gets 20%, and so on. And these policy priorities were negotiated in a number of workshops with council officers from across the organisation. You can see here that then this is sort of a snapshot from essentially the back end of the tool. And so we scored different forms of vegetation against the different functions. And these then, you can actually go to the green factor tool here at this URL. You put in your landscape plan, which requires you to enter in details about the area of all these different types of vegetation, and it will spit out a score. And City of Melbourne then defines a minimum score for residential developments, for commercial developments, and for industrial developments. And you have to achieve that or above for your application to be approved. Just noting that the planning scheme amendment is still awaiting advertising, approval for advertising. So it's the same issue of local government is ready to go, but is waiting for state government approval to take it to the next step. I just want to finally here reinforce that you can see that large trees get big scores, and additionally, if the development proposal is highlighting retention of existing trees, then that gets extra points as well. So in conclusion, just want to reinforce this is other research we've been doing looking at climate change in the built environment. And, you know, the built environment processes, urbanisation processes go through a whole range of stages, from change initiation, strategic planning, costing, design, construction, ongoing use, and then recovery or renewal or decommission. And of course, we all know that trees, the life and thriving of trees can be impacted at any one of those stages. And so in the same way that we need to have a number of different policy mechanisms, we also need to think about those different stages and how to retain trees across those different stages. So, of course, trees and greening in cities are magnificent. We all know that. And good luck, everyone, with your work to create and implement and enforce policy to help retain those trees. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Judy. That's terrific, and a great way to sort of round off what we've heard today. Summarising the policy settings, and then it's useful too that you took us through to the built form. And you know, we're certainly not only talking about trees, big trees, small trees. So very useful, thank you. And your last slide, all the benefits of nature in cities, is really the mantra of Cities with Nature. It's not just about ecosystems, it's about people's well-being, it's about attractive environments for commerce and tourism, etc. So that wraps it up very nicely. By the way, are you happy for anyone to reach out to you at University of Melbourne?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so
right.
I can see Beck. Thanks for the message. I've put the links to all the research publications in the slides, and apparently you'll all get copies of the slides. Okay. But if any of you have any trouble accessing anything, then yeah, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share material with you.
Beautiful, thank you. We also put the recording of the webinar up on our website as well, and Dustin will be sending out a thank you to all participants with those links. So do not fret, you don't need to have captured it all today. So now we move on to the second part of the webinar, which is your turn. We've been getting quite a lot of good questions in the chat function. And I'm going to hand over now to Belinda. And Belinda Bean she's got a terrific title. I love reading this one out. Collective Impact Strategist. You're probably the only collective impact strategist I know for the Greener Spaces, Better Places Australian program, which used to be Vision 2020-2020-2020. Belinda's going to facilitate this. Jessica's in the background helping to monitor the questions, and I'm going to sit back and listen and enjoy. So Belinda, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Bonnie, Michael and Judy. What great presentations we've had today, from policy settings and built form and everything in between. So I wanted to start by asking Bonnie, thank you so much for sharing your important research that you've done of regulatory and policy approaches for canopy protection. And as you said, they've all got their pros and cons, but I was wondering which, in your opinion, if any, have the potential to be replicated to the largest number of LGAs? Or do you think it's more nuanced than that and it needs to be a real LGA by LGA approach as the most appropriate, like what you've done at Nedlands?
Thanks, Belinda. And yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. I would say it needs to be nuanced. You can't just roll out the exact same package across the board, even though part of our work with the Gawler group is trying to standardise things that can be standardised, but still leaving room for nuance with each local government. I think the presentation which Judy provided was a really good one of how you can balance the different approaches. So there can be the regulatory approach, which we are doing as planners, but there's also other options in terms of incentivising. We've also got our parks team with like a planting rollout of trees, and it's trying to get people really excited and wanting to plant trees off their own volition. So it's definitely a mix of all of those different options, I think.
Excellent. Yes, and we'll be sure to share part one of this series, in which it was very much about the incentivising. So there's that bottom up, like how do we build grassroots support for having urban greening and trees in the first place? But then, you know, the focus today has been on that top down. So, you know, hopefully we can all meet in the middle in some lush urban paradise. So Bonnie, whilst I've got you on the mic as well, will there be an upskilling program for planners once this is rolled out?
I did see that question come through, and it's again a really good one. We will definitely be taking our statutory planners through, you know, the background to the planning work, how we envisage the discretion to be applied when those applications come in. But something that we've really realised through doing this work is this is something that our statutory planners are already really wanting to do. So there's already that desire when they receive development applications and there is a tree on site to retain the tree. So that they're already going back to applicants and doing those negotiations and trying to protect the trees as much as possible, but they just don't have the mechanisms in place behind them at the moment. And so we're hoping that if this work is, you know, finally put in place, that it can go hand in hand with what the planners are trying to do at the moment, and it can really back up, you know, the work that they're doing already.
Great. They just needed someone like you with the background ability to go into planning and pull it all together. So they're really lucky to have you. That's great. And there was a question, I know you put it in the slide. Is this actually, has the scheme amendment been approved? So you said it was.
So it's been approved for advertising. So it's kind of the first step. So council said, yes, we're happy with this approach. Let's put it out to the community and see what they think. But before that, we need the Planning Commission to say it's okay to advertise. We need the EPA to sign it off as well. So once we get that okay, we'll advertise it, we'll potentially update it, put it back through council, put it back through the commission. So we've still got a bit of a way to go yet, but it's really great that we've kind of got through that first step of it.
Excellent. Well, good luck, and I'm sure we'll
Thank you.
be watching and wanting to hear updates as it progresses.
Thanks very much.
So, Michael, loved your presentation and enthusiasm and the innovative approach that you're taking at Unley. Really, every property has its own rates notice with its tree canopy cover versus its canopy cover from 3 years ago. That's incredible. How are you doing that?
Well, it's an award-winning program, national award-winning by the IT for our staff here working with SMX. And look, could I just go something that Bonnie took up? Look, in South Australia, our basic problem, we've got a one-size-fits-all. And let's tell you, the needs of some of our outer suburbs with lots of parks and gardens and lots of open space are quite different from the needs of an inner city, where the first thing a developer does is remove every single tree. Not actually, that's overstated. The first thing half the developers do is remove every tree and produce something which causes that 2 hectares of annual loss. Okay. Now, your question, far away.
The question about the rates notice.
Yep.
Just I saw that Beck put some information. I knew you'd know Beck Taylor wherever you are, about the LiDAR mapping that was done in 2018, 2019, yep, and then again in 2022. So I'm guessing, is that where the analysis has come from? And then you've got this IT people that have managed to figure out what that canopy percentage is per household.
Yes.
And put that on a rates notice.
Yes. Yep. It's actually, we did our own just as a City of Unley in 2021, so that we would get the data to go to the Minister to present our argument. We do know what the problem is. Our purpose was to actually identify what the problem we were trying to do, what was causing the problems of the loss of trees. And we've done that very successfully. Yes, the staff have worked they've done our own work to get the trees down, not only to site and siding, but down to the individual property. Yes, we had to go through by hand all the past DAs. It's a huge amount of work for the whole 3 years, and work out which have increased the built form. Because if you build a fence, you need a DA, or you put an aerial up. None of those sorts of things count because they don't increase the built form. And so a swimming pool does. Knocking one down and building 2 does. But if you knock one down and build 2 on the same footprint, it doesn't. And so we had to go, because it wasn't a criteria we were looking for. So our staff really all deserve a gold medal, really. I just hope that we can make all the work pay and deliver some results. We've actually delivered 2 hectares, I reckon, because the very educational power of informing the community of where they're at is, I think, been a great step. So, but it's not enough. If we do not do some new incentives that actually deliver, our children will cook like the Western Sydney suburbs, 50 degrees.
Belinda, I just wondered if I could interrupt, because I noticed Kat Ryan is here, and Kat is
she's
probably, yeah, she's probably the staff member that Michael's talking about. So Kat's here with us, and I'm sure you can chat to each other.
Yeah.
Great. Oh, thank you. And I see, Kat, you've just popped a link in for people to explore that canopy map. So that's excellent. Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, look, Michael, I agree with that sentiment, and you know, hopefully you do succeed in getting these regulatory incentives. But if there was some way we could quantify that educational power that you were doing through those rates notices, I think that would be absolutely fantastic. So we've also had a question about how often you collect the tree canopy data. Was that once seemed like every sort of 3 years, if it was 2018 or 2022?
We've got a statewide one this year, and the data will be processed, I suppose, in about November, December this year, when it all comes through. And really, our thinking is we probably need to do it each year if we're going to get the approval, so that when a person gets their 15% cover of a new development, we can automatically remove the loading. And policing, we've got the policing sorted. I mean, we can deliver.
Excellent. Well, definitely one to watch. We do have a question about how we can collaborate better. What would you like to see various groups doing to support your important work, Michael?
Oh, that's a very interesting one. Look, we have had wonderful support of the councils around us. They have the Eastern Region Alliance of Councils. Before the last election, we wrote unitedly. They all asked that Unley Council be given the opportunity to do this trial. And we can then have data that's worldwide applicable. I mean, what we've got in Unley is not untypical elsewhere. We're lucky that we started to catch the problem a bit before we dropped down to 20% like Nedlands. But we're on the way there. We've gone from 34% down to 26% in the last couple of decades. And we were certainly on the way. We've reversed it, and diversity is temporary. We tell the truth.
Excellent. Great. And there was a specific question about architects. How can architects help? And I put this out to all the panelists. How can architects help? We've got a keen one in the room, clearly.
Well, first, I'll plough in. Clearly, if there was a real incentive to get your 15% or 10% cover, architects, I think, will be much more heavily relied on in actually doing design work to keep the trees that are already existing on the property. Now, look, please, you have to understand, we now also know that there's a few more new developments that actually increase the tree canopy. So we've got really about 55% of new developments delivering a 15% increase in canopy, and we've got 45% from. So if architects, once we need the driver, and that's what we heard from Judy, University of Melbourne. You need the incentive driver pushing it the way up.
Anyone else care to comment on architects' support?
I was going to add that certainly having architects, making sure that the landscape architects are around the design table at the start of the process and not brought in at the end of the process to, you know, draw a bit of green on the map. I think, hi Jane, I think really making sure that biophilia is something that architects recognise as well. And yeah, Adrian's put into the comments, start the design based on tree retention. Exactly. So assume green at the start of the process rather than try and add it in belatedly at the end. Yeah. I'm keen to, I've been watching the chat and there's some really interesting questions about the whole development process and how to try and preempt developers going, we'll just remove these trees before we put in our development application and then they won't have to be, you know, considered. But I'm interested to hear, Bonnie, how you're addressing that. You know, I've read various bits of research talking about that, but that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, certainly. And that's essentially what our work is trying to address. Because at the moment, you can just remove the trees off the property, put in your DA and say that there's no trees to retain, so we're good to go. But what our work will be doing is putting in a trigger that even before you're looking at, you know, building your house or your apartments or whatever it is, if you're wanting to remove a tree that meets that criteria, that in and of itself needs development approval. So even if it's not associated with any development, classical development, that in itself would need approval from the city. So you wouldn't be able to just go in, clear them, and then put your DA in for the development.
Look, I'd like to contribute. One of the things that was talked about by Judy and the rules about removing trees which are healthy, and it all sounds great. We've had development applications to remove remnant hundreds of years old grey box trees from the city of Unley on the premise that they got an arborist to say how crooked they were. And when the tree is actually pulled down, and the neighbours all write to me as their mayor and say, but the tree was perfectly healthy, it should never have come down. They're lying. And the other problem is we have in South Australia, all you have to do is for any tree, significant tree, hundreds of years old, is put a building within 10 metres of it. Oh, it's causing problems. Or it gets in the road of your development. That tree comes out. I actually think that I'm very proud of our elected body, that they've actually taken the budget by the horns and actually funded the LiDAR collection on the annual basis, actually funded the cost of all the work the staff have done to deliver the program, and actually had the courage to look up the data and publish it and get it out there to our community. I think incentives are needed to encourage builders to actually, because they're profit motivated. And if their house has got higher rates they're trying to sell because they haven't got their trees, that's going to bite as soon as it starts to become known.
Yeah, incentives needed for sure. We do have a comment that Paul would like to make. Paul, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself. He's offered to give a brief comment on Judy's presentation from a New Zealand perspective. So please.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just a brief comment, really more prompted by Bonnie's options that she presented. I just thought you might like to hear a brief perspective from New Zealand. So most of those options, there were 5, I think, on your table. There have been tried in one part of New Zealand or another, with varying degrees of success, and often with expertise borrowed from Australia. But I just thought I'd comment in particular on one, which is mapping, identifying and then protecting significant natural areas, which proceeds under our Umbrella Resource Management Act legislation. And I think in Australia you do that over landscape areas, large landscape areas. But here in New Zealand, where it's being done in urban areas as well as rural areas. So that might be a difference. And that's going to be mandated shortly after a decades-long delay, and again under the Resource Management Act, by a national policy statement that's at national level, that all districts will have to carry out significant natural area assessments. So, there are quite strict significance criteria, and the areas have to be very carefully bounded. Also, they're not subject to just individual trees, but the areas have to be, those areas are specified on planning maps. And then there are protective rules and policies for those significant natural areas. So what you might be interested to know is that because of those property rights issues, those SNA surveys and the policy settings for them have been quite controversial pretty well everywhere, but it's quite noticeable that they are less controversial in the big metropolitan areas. There's a greater degree of support. There's the same amount of noise from people who are adamantly opposed, but there is a greater degree of support in urban areas. Now, and so that sounds good that it applies to urban areas, but in the cities, that will only apply to your top gens that qualify, under the assessment criteria. So that leaves all the other leafy areas subject to the losses that you have, all 3 speakers have talked about. And in my opinion, we're quite a long way behind where you are in Australia in the range of innovative ideas I've heard just tonight and others that I've heard of. We don't have the tools, the policy tools, or the technologies to put into place a lot of what I've heard. So it's perhaps a mixed bag from New Zealand. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, it's interesting to hear the different approaches in different countries and see how we can learn and leapfrog and, do this together. So I appreciate that comment and perspective. We're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes, so I just want to give one last question. This is for any and all of the panel that would like to comment. But are there any replicatable or scalable solutions for greening the private realm that can be done at a city scale?
Well, certainly if we get given the go to do our trial, the data will be watched very closely by the other inner metropolitan areas around Adelaide. And I suspect it's transferable to anywhere in the world. And so the importance of our minister, so if anybody knows Nick Champion, give him a phone call, will you? And indicate the global importance of at least doing the experiment to find out what the effect is. And I suspect it'd be very powerful.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. Anyone else?
One tries.
I'll jump in by just reinforcing a call for a range of mechanisms. So adding incentives to regulations and not just going straight to regulation, but really thinking about incentives as well. And I mean, we've all been in the situation, I'm sure, of mourning the illegal removal of a tree. They're pretty fast to remove, and a fine doesn't really make up for the sadness in our hearts and the heat on our streets. So yeah, we need to foster a sense of stewardship of nature and trees in cities, maybe through incentives, awards, grants, engagement, tree planting, notices on rates, and regulation. Yeah, so that's my last word.
Yeah, great suite of solutions there. And I think that reflects Bonnie's comment of, you know, it needing to be a nuanced approach and nuanced and diversified for sure. But in the meantime, we can all give this Nick chap a call, Michael. So this trial needs to happen.
Judy's made a very important point about regulation. That's important. Because of the regulations that have been put in place in the new code that what we're proposing can actually work, makes it fair, because our regulations require the building to have the soft soil or the deep soil, and they require the new developments to plant a tree. What we're doing in Unley is building on that and saying, we're going to provide an incentive not to plant it, just to grow it as well. So the regulation is important to make it socially just, because otherwise the next buyer of the property would have a property where you couldn't get the 15%, and that wouldn't be fair.
Excellent. And a lovely comment to wrap up here from Paul, you know, yeah, no silver bullet, but the combination of incentives and regulations that we've heard about today is very impressive. And I agree. Thank you all so much. Steve, are you going to say a few words to wrap?
Thank you, Belinda. No, I'm actually sitting here sobbing because in the last 3 months, my neighbour has managed to remove every tree in his backyard, and there was nothing could be done about it. So, inner Melbourne, don't you love it? Thank you very much, everyone. I would like to ask the participants to stay on for about 2 more minutes. We've got a couple of important news items. But first, I'd like to thank again very much our panellists, Bonnie Hall, Mayor Michael Hewitson, Dr. Judy Bush, and Belinda for the very able facilitation. It was a bit like watching an episode of Q&A on the ABC, wasn't it, actually? Yeah. So, Dustin, can you put up a couple of slides for us, please? Thank you. So, firstly, you'll remember our first webinar this year in April was introducing you to the Action Platform, which is on the Cities with Nature global platform. We're going to run another webinar on that in about a month's time to demonstrate how the Action Platform works, how it feeds into the global biodiversity monitoring framework, etc. So I would just keep an eye on the ICLEI website for that. We'll certainly advise everyone who's here today when that webinar is set up, but probably September or October that will be. Thanks, Dustin. And the next slide. We're very aware that Cities with Nature, it's huge interest, just you know, as witnessed by the number of people who attended today. We would welcome many other councils around Australia to join. And the base, let's call it the base level Cities with Nature program is absolutely free to any council. You don't need to be an ICLEI member. We'd love you to be, but you don't need to be. But we are now looking at developing a second level of value, which may be called the Cities with Nature Academy, or that's a working title, or a learning hub, or something along those lines, where we can dig a lot deeper into some of these big issues that we're identifying. And that might be training, it might be peer-to-peer exchange, it might be co-designing and co-creating solutions. It will have academic partners. So we're just working on that. My colleague Helene Stanley is with us today, and fairly soon we're going to be reaching out to some of our Cities with Nature councils to see if you'd like to be in the first group. So that's another, watch this space. In another month or so, we'll be probably ready to go public. So thank you again for attending. I'd like now to hand over to Amanda Stone, the chair of our RexCom, for a final few words. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, and thanks to all our presenters. I echo Martin Hartigan's words that you feel less alone when you hear all the inspiring things others are doing. But similarly to everyone who's turned up today, it's great to know that there's all of you struggling away with the same issues and taking inspiration from each other. I want to acknowledge that today is the last day at ICLEI of Jess Robbins, who's sitting in the middle there with her green jumper on. Jess has been a dynamo who's driven a lot of the action at ICLEI as our programs and partnerships manager in a short time, but she's laid the groundwork for some wonderful work to continue, which will continue. She's moving over to the city of Hobart, so she won't be far away and still in our circle and engaged, I'm sure. So thank you on behalf of everyone, Jess, and all the best with your next step. And to everyone else, keep up the good work and stay connected to all of us and each other. Thank you.